Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Women on the Move. I am Marjorie Schuster, coordinator of literary events here at the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center. Today is an exciting day. We are meeting our 36th author since we began this series. And we are so happy that Celeste Ng, New York Times bestselling author Celeste Ng, will be joining us today. Our Missing Hearts was one of the best books I've read in a very long time. It is absolutely an incredible read. It's a Reese Witherspoon book club pick and an Amazon Book of the Month pick. Our moderator today is Zibby Owens, who at this point really needs no introduction. She's, a magazine publisher, a podcaster. She's written, 3 books, and now has a publishing company. And that mom does have time to do it all. This will be a terrific conversation, and I hope you will all enjoy it. And by the way, as always, I'd like to thank the Samuel I. Newhouse Foundation for their support of this series. And please write your questions on the chat, and we will try to get to as many as we can. Now, I'd like to welcome Celeste and Zibby. Good morning, Celeste. Good morning, Zibby.
Good morning. Hi.
Morning. Thank you, Marjorie.
Very welcome. Have a fabulous discussion.
Thanks, Marjorie. Hi, Zibby. It's so nice to see you.
It's so nice to see you too. How's everything? Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Well, another whirlwind publication for you, and congratulations. It's fantastic. Well done. For anyone who has not read Our Missing Hearts quite yet, would you mind giving a quick synopsis?
Sure. It's a story of a 12-year-old boy named Bird. He's growing up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he's being raised by just his father. His mother, Margaret, has left the family some years before. And the world Bird lives in isn't exactly our world. It's our world with sort of like the volume turned up a little bit. He's living in a world that's really full of fear. The United States has gone through a period of crisis, and they're trying to come out of it. And one result is that there's a lot of anti-Asian hostility. And this is a problem for Bird because he's mixed race. His mother is Chinese American and his father is white. And at the beginning of the book, Bird gets a letter from his mother, who he hasn't seen in some years. It's actually very mysterious. And he's drawn into a quest to try to find her, to try to understand what happened to his family, and to try to figure out sort of who he is and how to go on in this life.
Wow. Well, I feel like this book is so multi-layered. There is a commentary on basically everything that's going on, which is evidenced by your author note at the end on all the many sources that you used, all about things that are going on in the political environment, all the anti-Asian sentiment that has happened of late, nationalism, so much. But also at the center of this whole story is books. So I was hoping we could start literal with the book in a book nature of this and the power of books, and also what you said in this book, which I found so interesting, that as soon as a book, let me see if I can find the quote. You said, behind them, empty bookshelves. Bird has never seen books on them, but there they stand, fossils of a long gone era. Did you know, their teacher explained the year before, that paper books are out of date the instant they're printed? The beginning of your welcome talk, all of them sitting crisscross applesauce on the carpet at her feet. That's how fast the world changes, and our understanding of it too. So talk to me about this sort of temporal quality of a book.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I've heard many people say. I'm a book person myself, so obviously I'm a little bit biased against that point of view. And I'm guessing by the giant bookshelves behind you, it's like I realize I also have my bookshelves. I think there's an idea lately that, print books, not lately, this idea that print books are out of date, or that print books are dying, or that books generally are dying, especially in the age of the internet. And this book was one way of exploring sort of what I thought about that, and of realizing that stories that get passed on really do have a meaning, that there is a value in not only the book itself, but in just passing on and remembering those stories. One of the things that's happening to Bird is that books and certain kinds of stories are being removed from his world. And so there's a lot of things that he can't find out, including his own mother's book. His mother was a poet, and he wants to try and find out what her work was as a way of understanding her. And part of the question is, what do we get from stories, and what do we get from stories that get passed on? And do they change as time goes on? And maybe that's even a good thing.
It's True. And I feel like it's also the only way to really capture the people that you love. And I feel like Bird is trying so hard to do that, is to find these pieces of his mom when he is looking for her. And how do you make someone sort of stay alive forever in a way?
Exactly. It's the stories that we tell about them. I mean, I realize that more and more now that I have a kid, but I'm also a daughter. I'm realizing that there are stories about my mother and my parents and the rest of my family that I don't know. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I get those so that I can get them? And then how do I pass them on to my kid? Because in a way, that's, like you said, that's who those people are, really, where you can know their statistics and their names and their facts and their pictures, but knowing something about who they were, it often comes from story.
So true. I feel like Bird is this little detective sort of trying to find his way back and through and decipher all the signs. So there's almost a little, not thriller, but a little bit of a discovery mission going on in this book as well.
Yeah, he thinks of himself actually as a character who's on a quest. One of the things that happens in the book is he remembers a folk tale that his mother had told him, and he can't quite remember how it goes. He remembers a little bit of it, and he's looking for that story. And while he's doing that, he's thinking of himself as, like the youngest son of the kingdom who's going on the quest, or the prince who's going into the castle that hasn't been touched in years in Sleeping Beauty to try and rediscover all of those things.
You have this wonderful scene where he's in a library, and libraries also play a huge role in this book. But in the back sort of closet where he discovers a card catalog, which isn't even described as a card catalog. It's like, back in the day, we could pull out these drawers and find things by topic. And then he's just wowed by sort of the vastness. He didn't realize there could be that many books.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a library nerd. I love libraries, as will probably be clear to anybody who reads this book. But of course, Bird has never seen a card catalog, as I think many young people now have not. We have it all in a database, which is great in many ways. But one thing that I loved about the card catalog was there's sort of a sense of how many books there are in the library, right? And that it's all in there somewhere and you can find it. So he has this sudden awakening that there's so much more knowledge out there than he even knew was possible. And it's a sort of, it's essentially a coming of age for him, but mentally.
And the librarians and everybody say, well, we would never burn books here. We're just going to make them into pulp and sort of get rid of them and make them into toilet paper, whatever it is. But the way that the information gets curated is the wrong word, really, banned essentially, and micromanaged is sort of similar to the way that everybody now can customize their news feeds. Do you know what I mean? Like, you can actually get through life with just a sliver of what you choose to read and have a totally different sense of life from someone right next to you who gets all different news and all different inputs. And yet here they're trying to make this with packed, the standard for everyone. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think of this story in some ways about Bird as a young person sort of figuring out the context in which he lives. He's 12 years old, as I said, and he is at that age where for a lot of us, we're starting to realize that there's a bigger world out there. So it's around that age, I think a lot of times we start to realize, oh, history did not start with me. There's actually this whole past. And maybe if I learn something about it, it'll inform something about how I see the world, right? Or how I understand it. And he's starting to understand too that his parents had a life before him, right? And that maybe they have a life outside of him. And I think that's what happens to a lot of us around that age. And I think of this as sort of like the zooming out that happens when you start to move from childhood to adulthood. You're looking through the world and you think the world is this big. And then you realize that actually there's all this other space outside of that little picture frame. And in a way, as you're saying, the idea that you can see all those books or all those stories, or as you say, all those, parts of of life outside of just the narrow window you've been choosing to look through. I think that's all the context you need to figure out sort of where you are, who you are, and what kind of person you want to be.
So true. Well, I think your book touches so much on discrimination also, and has some really sort of upsetting moments. One in the pizza shop where the owner decides not to serve the Asian gentleman who walks in. And then they have this moment, which you don't understand till later, where he says, he's one of them when referring to Bird. And then another, which sounds like it was like right by the Streicker Center, sort of on the Upper East Side, and this, out my window here, but where this woman who looks just like Bird's mom was across the street. He realizes it's not her. And as he's processing all of these things, a white man comes up and starts just pummeling her and kick until she's motionless. And he just has to stand there, so shaking, which as a reader, I felt the same way, just reverberating from the sort of shock of this brazen attack and in the open. So tell me about your decision to include violence like that and to really take some things which horrifically are in the news and bring them into the story. And obviously, when you tell it through as a story, it's so impactful, much more so than if you just read facts, which goes back, of course, to the book motif.
Yeah. I mean, that was something that I really hesitated about. Did I want to include it? It was something that I mean, honestly, it's not something that I want to think about, but it is a part of our reality. And I had started this book some years ago, well before the pandemic, well before even the 2016 election. But when I started seeing attacks on Asians and Asian Americans, especially after the start of the pandemic, it felt really important to actually look at that and include it. It's something that I've been aware of my whole life as a Chinese American woman, but I think it was something that not everyone was aware of. And suddenly we started seeing attacks, as you say, in New York, in broad daylight, in, San Francisco, again, in broad daylight, often attacking elderly people, but out in the open. And there was an attack in particular that I was thinking of when I was writing the scene that you mentioned that took place in New York. It might be one of the ones you're thinking of, in which a person was just stomped on. And nobody did anything, which was one of the most horrifying things about it to me, except for the doorman of the building that was outside, who came out and closed the door. And I thought, if we're in a space where people can really just look away, then we've really turned a corner. And that's a huge, huge problem. And so in a way, I wanted to include this in the book, partly because it is something that I'm seeing and processing in our world, but also because it's something that it felt important to ask people to witness, in a way, to sort of acknowledge, like, this is happening. And if you didn't know it was happening, now you do. And once you do, what do we do about that? In a way, it was sort of a way of saying to people, this is something, as you say, we might skim over it in the news, but sometimes when you see in a story, it can hit you in an emotional way that makes you engage with it differently.
Do you feel like you were able to process some things about this through writing it? I mean, I feel like any book where you delve into something sort of horrific that's happening, whether it's the Holocaust or this sort of history of anti-Asian sentiment or whatever, like there is a way of using the text to sort of work your way through it. Do you feel like that at all, or am I totally off base here?
No, yes and no. I feel like in a lot of ways, when I go into a book, it is because there's something I don't understand. And a lot of times I don't even understand what it is that I don't understand. By the end of the book, I might have a better understanding of it, but at least I feel like I've outlined sort of the questions that I'm asking. I've outlined the thing that's puzzling me. And hopefully I presented those questions to a reader too. Whatever answers they come up with, I think, are going to be from them speaking with the book in a way. And I feel like for me, it's more that I've sort of set an outline around these questions. I've articulated them to myself, and now I can think about them a little bit more clearly. I certainly don't come out at the end, sort of going, well, now I understand this and I understand what happened. That would be a miracle and kind of wonderful. But in a way, it's my way of sharing these questions with other people.
Yeah, that makes sense. You, through Bird and also through Sadie, you talk about, or you write about what happens when children are removed essentially from their parents, and the fact that this is also happening a lot now. Talk to me about that element and also, Bird and Sadie's relationship.
Yeah. So one of the things that's happening in this world is there are a series of laws that are intended to kind of increase patriotism. But one of the big tenets of the law is that if you're seen as acting unpatriotic, the government can remove your children, ostensibly to protect them from this unpatriotic view. But in this world, that's often being applied against Chinese Americans and Asian Americans, but then really anybody who dares to speak up on their behalf. And this was a thing that I was thinking about from the beginning of the story, well before we started to hear about these sorts of things in the news, because as a parent, That's, I think, one of the biggest fears that I can imagine myself, as being separated from my child. And I had known that this had happened in different times in history. But when I started researching it, I realized that it had happened even more than I had understood, obviously going all the way back to enslaved families, but with Native American boarding schools, or as it was called, residential schools, where they were supposed to be Americanized. And then, of course, when we started seeing news about family separations at the US-Mexico border, it was really startling to see how history was just repeating itself. And in a way, I think history was repeating itself because we haven't really looked back at all of the different times in our past and present that this is still happening.
Oh my gosh. Well, in addition to having all of these themes and really thought-provoking political, geopolitical concepts, there's also the writing of this book, which is so beautiful. And there are just like a handful of lines, even like little sentences that I underlined. Could I just read a couple if you don't mind? He should burn the letter himself. It isn't safe having anything of hers around. This is when Bird gets a letter right in the beginning from his mom. More than this, when he sees his name, his old name on the envelope, a door inside him creaks open and a draft snakes in. That's just a beautiful way to say that. That was amazing. Here, I read this about the book. Then you talk this is when there's all this yarn that just gets put in a tree as a demonstration. And you write, something inside Bird cracks and unravels too at the sight of something so delicate and intricate destroyed. The dolls tremble, trapped in their red net. His skin feels too small for his thoughts. I love that. These are some of my favorites here. Wait, hold on. I have, let's see. This is when his dad is not coming. I talked about that. Wait, hold on. There are a few more lines. Well, at least we can, this one was great. Okay, this is also about the libraries. So this is about the New York Public Library, actually. You had a lot of New York specific references in here, which I appreciated from New York City. Bird
goes to New York, and for him, it's both this sort of like fairy tale land and this land of wonder where sort of anything can happen, which is kind of how I feel about New York a lot of the time as a non-New Yorker. But it's also a world it's bigger than any place that he's been in. He's never been there before. He's never left Cambridge before. And it's a little bit scary for him too. It's just a whole new world that he has to figure out how to navigate.
Actually, you talked about, this is when you're like up here in the neighborhood. I'll just read this part too. In each window, the familiar star-spangled placard, banners advertising the fanciness of what they had, not its cheapness. Higher and higher the cross streets climb, as if he is scaling a ladder. This is when he's discovering New York. 50th, 55th, 56th. Men in suits, men with ties, men in leather shoes with fringed tassels and smooth soles in which you had no need to run. Long ago, his father had worn shoes like that. Then you keep going. It says a department store the length of an entire block. I think we're walking past Bergdorf's at this point. All sleek dark granite, polished to mirrored gloss, as if to say, in this place, even stones shine like stars. And then you go through apartment buildings. I want to get to the Upper East Side women here. Hold on. He said, now there are coffee shops, places meant to linger in, billboards for whitening and straightening teeth, hotels with suited bellhops and hats poised just outside. Here, people hold bags not meant to carry, but to be pretty. Dry cleaner after dry cleaner, a neighborhood of silk too delicate to wash. At each door, burly men from the neighborhood watch, stand guard. 75th Street, 76th. Older buildings that wore their age gracefully, looking staid, not shabby. Shops labeled gourmet and luxury and vintage. He likes the thought of his mother here in this beautiful place. Blonde women in jogging tights puff beside him, ponytails bobbing as they wait for the signal to change. Nannies push sleek strollers. The babies inside, sumptuously dressed. One more line. He passes stores that make only picture frames, restaurants that serve only salad, shops selling pink shirts embroidered with tiny smiling whales. Buildings so tall, their tips are invisible. Even when he cranes his head so far, he nearly falls backward. Anything could happen here. Everything does happen here.
It was a little bit of my love letter to New York. I mean, writing it during the pandemic where I wasn't able to go to New York, I was thinking about all the things in New York that are weird and wonderful, and that, it's not like a lot of other places. And I wanted to I think it comes out how much I was like, oh, New York. I miss being in New York, and just how everything is there. I mean, there's so much.
Well, the way that you write about New York, the way you write about motherhood and separation, all of it, the language that you choose to use, sort of, it's like you use analogies and times to really, and so many I don't know, like using different elements to describe things. Mm-hmm. Tell me about your writing methodology and like how you come up with things. Do you spend a lot of time on each sentence? Is this honed from classes? Is it just from all of your successful work to date? Where does this all come from? Or is it just totally natural to you?
I mean, I think it's been a long process, and I feel like I'm still sort of honing my voice. I write by ear, honestly. I used to want to be a poet. And one of the things that I love is hearing language read aloud. And so when I'm writing, I'm listening to it in my head. And I'm sort of thinking about how it sounds. And sometimes it doesn't sound quite right. If you are a musician, or if you have ever listened to musicians tuning up, there's a moment where, they're changing the tune and then you hear it hit the right note and it suddenly sounds right. That's kind of how writing feels to me a lot of the time. I'm like, it's not quite right. I don't really know if it's sharp or it's flat, but I'm going to turn it one way. Oh, there it is. Right. And for me, it's that sense. And so I write, as I say, by ear. I read aloud a lot. But at the same time, I try really hard to imagine what the world is like for my characters. I try really hard to imagine what it might feel like to be in their body, to be, for example, a 12-year-old who is small and feeling a little overwhelmed, but also kind of dazzled by the biggest city that he's ever been in, right? And more people and more different kinds of people than he's ever been around. And then I also try to think about, if he hadn't seen this before, what might it remind him of? My sister used to tell me that I had a mind like a little filing cabinet. And anytime I saw something new, she could see me as a toddler kind of riffling through and looking for something to refer to. And in a way, I think that's sort of how I tried to write Bird as well. He hasn't seen a lot of these things. As you say, he doesn't know the words for a lot of these things. He doesn't know the names of the stores he's walking by, right? He doesn't know the names of the neighborhoods that he's in. But he's trying to kind of get a handle on them in some way. He doesn't know what a card catalog is, but he knows it's a huge piece of furniture and it's massive and weighty. Nobody could move it in. It's got all these drawers in it, right? He can describe it, even if he can't name it. And in a way, that's the voice that I wanted to try to get for the book.
Amazing. Wait, so tell me, you said you started this before the pandemic. What was the whole journey with this? And did you start other projects in the meantime? And when did you know this was the next book to go and all of that?
Yeah, it really started for me as I was finishing my second novel, Little Fires Everywhere. There's an artistic mother in that book as well. She's a visual artist, and her daughter really understands and supports the art she does. She thinks her mother's work is important. And I started to think, what if there was a case where there was a creative parent and their child just did not fundamentally understand why their parent wanted to do this thing, and maybe even saw it as a rival for their attention or for their affection or for their time. So that was the idea that I had. It always began with a parent-child story. And I started tinkering with this idea, and that was in late October of 2016. And so it was very soon thereafter that I think we started to see a lot of really sort of scary things in our country really coming to the surface. They'd always been there. But we saw, of course, the presidential election. We saw the rise of the far right. We saw a huge rise in hate crimes of all kinds and kind of a normalization of a sort of angry jingoism, I guess. The sort of sense of us versus them. And that started to run into the book. It was weird to pretend that wasn't in the story when it was such a big part of life around me. And so I started thinking about this novel. I realized that it was going to be in a world that wasn't quite like ours, but that was maybe ours a little bit more so. And I didn't know how to write it. I wasn't sure I wanted to write it. The real world was feeling dystopian enough. And I wasn't really sure that I wanted to write this book, let alone that I knew how to do it. And so I did. And it's funny that you ask. I started another book in the meantime, and I wrote a whole draft of it, but I kept coming back to this one. And I kept coming back to Bird and his mother. And I would imagine things, and then they would happen in real life, or things would happen in real life, and it would speak to the novel. And I would poke at it for a while, and then I'd kind of put it away in despair. And it wasn't really until the pandemic started that I felt like this was the book that I was being called to do, that was calling to me. I'd actually talked to my agent, and we'd agreed I was going to work on this other novel. I would deal with, Bird and his story sometime after that. And it was maybe April, just after everything had shut down. I emailed my agent and I said, I know I'm supposed to be doing this other project, but I think I need to work on this book. Like, I think I'm wrestling with stuff and I need to figure this out. Please don't be mad. And she wrote back and said, I actually was just going to email you the same thing. I feel like this is a book that feels so relevant and so timely, even though it's not about the pandemic. It is about how you live in a world that feels like it's falling apart and how you parent or try to speak to the next generation in a time of fear. And so it wasn't until then that I really sort of turned my full attention to it. And I started trying to put together all of the scraps and pieces of the book, and came up with what turned into Our Missing Hearts.
And so what happened to the other book?
It's still here. I have the draft. It's safely stored in my computer. And, I think I've been focused. I haven't been writing lately. I've been focused on trying to get this book out into the world, with sort of as much care and love as possible. But I'll go back to it at some point, because every book I start is because there's something that I'm trying to figure out. And so that book too, I have to go back and look at it and figure out what is it that was pulling me to that book. For me, the first draft is always about figuring out what questions I'm even asking, figuring out what the story even is. And so it often takes a while for me after I finish a draft. I'll go back 3 months or 6 months later, and then I have a better sense of, this is what I'm interested in. I'm going to focus on that in my revision. In this case, I've got that first draft. It's just been like 2 years. So hopefully I'll go back to it with some clearer eyes.
That's awesome. It's like a sculptor leaving this thing like ready to go. Like we have like a little sheet over it. You're ready
to
pull it up. Yeah.
A friend of mine who's also a writer refers to this as the fallow period. Like if you're in agriculture, like you plant crops, but then you have to let the field sit for a little while to kind of get nutrients back into it, to kind of, replenish the soil. And I like that idea too, in a way that, it's growing something, it's getting ready to grow something bigger. But for right now, it just needs to sit and kind of let nutrients soak into it, let, all the, worms go in and do all of their stuff.
I think I'm trying to write a novel now too. I feel like now I feel better that it's not just sitting there. There's actually some stuff going on.
I'll tell you what, my analogy is it's not quite as nice as the fallow field. I think of it as the compost heap.
Okay.
You throw stuff in there and you don't know exactly what it's going to do, but at a certain point it'll kind of break down and it'll turn into this wonderful, rich, nutritious thing, but it just takes a while. Mm-hmm. And it can't be rushed, and it takes as long as it takes. So that's my rationale, but I'm discovering that I seem to take 5 to 6 years at least to come up with a novel. So maybe that's just rationalization.
I'm going with it. I like it.
Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I remember talking to the poet Elizabeth Rosner, and she said, our books take as long as they take because it takes us that long to become the people who can write them. And I really like that idea a lot too. The idea that it's not that the book is this thing that's not coming together. It's not that, you're not doing the right thing. It's just that you and the book kind of have to grow and mature and kind of think about each other. And then eventually it comes together. I like that idea of looking at it a lot. And of course, she's a poet, so it's beautifully said.
Wow, I love that. That's great. I know in the acknowledgments you thank your son and how important he is to you and everything. And a minute ago you mentioned that there are some competing. What if a child felt that the mother's work is sort of competing for attention? Do you ever feel like that with your son, that your work is sort of taking over your life and maybe he wishes that you weren't doing it?
I mean, I think most working parents feel that way, honestly. My work is important to me, and I try to tell him both of those things. It's something that I learned from my agent. I try to tell him, I'm really glad I do my work. I love my work. It's important to me. I'm good at it, and it's meaningful to me. And I do think it makes me a better parent. But I try to also tell him, I don't like being away from you. I'm happy when I get to come home and be with you, and that you are also one of my most important jobs, probably the most important job, but I don't always say that to him. Get too full of himself. But I try to be honest with him that I'm a human and that I'm trying to balance things. I used to have this idea that as a parent, and especially as a mom, because there's a lot of societal pressures on moms, I used to have this idea that I had to be a superhero and I had to never let it show that I was sweating or struggling or in any way. And I've kind of changed my thinking on that. And especially when it comes to my kid, I kind of want to let him know, hey, sometimes things are hard. Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to. I'm doing my best. I'm human. And by extension, that also means it's okay if you feel like there's too much, or you feel like things are hard, or all of these things. Like, I want him to know that. I don't want him to learn that when he's an adult and he realizes that actually it's really tough to keep all of your balls in the air, which it is when you're an adult. And so I'm trying to show him and tell him that we're all human and that we don't always know what's best. We're trying our best, but maybe we make mistakes. And actually, I think that was a lesson that came into the book as well. A lot of the story, I think, is about Bird learning that his mother is also a human and is also fallible and is also struggling, but also trying to do her best. I know there were a lot of alsos in there, but I feel like that is part of what I'm trying to say to my kid is it's usually not either or. It's usually both of those things and some other stuff. And we're trying to figure out how to make it all work.
Bird's dad too. I mean, that's another important relationship. And,
Absolutely. I'm really glad you mentioned him, because I feel like because I'm a mother, people tend to ask me about the mother-son relationship, and it's a big one. But his father is also there and also trying to do his best, and also trying to deal with a situation in which his wife and partner is gone, in which he's raising a child, and in a world that is really hostile to his son, but in ways that he himself maybe hasn't experienced or doesn't understand. He's also trying to do his best.
Yeah. That whole Sisyphean putting back of the books every day and doing all this for his son. And if the dining room's closed, having to make this poor box of mac and cheese. I mean,
exactly. I feel like that. I mean, that honestly comes from, parenting moments I've had where you had a plan and then everything goes sideways. And there is sort of a value, I think, in being able to say, okay, that was not the plan. We're going to regroup. We're going to make the best of things. And we'll try again, to just acknowledge that sometimes things don't go the way you expected. And what are you going to do about it? You keep going.
Yeah, no other choice. Well, I know there are a lot of questions here, so let me go to some of those.
Okay.
1 second. Here, I'm going to just go down here to my Google Doc. 1 second. Where did that go? Okay. Open this up. All right. Karen is saying, I thought it was very interesting that the fact that Bird really looked like his mother in the sense that he was of Asian descent was not really focused on right away. Did I not pick up on it, or was that purposeful? I liked the feeling that it was aside from the initial point of Bird.
Yeah. Well, I think it's always safe to assume that anything in a book is purposeful. And especially if it feels like it has meaning to you, that meaning is absolutely valid. One of the things that I've learned as a Chinese American woman, and particularly one who's grown up and lives in places where there aren't very many other East Asians, is that I don't go around through my day sort of thinking about how I look different to people. I'm just going about my day doing my things. And I feel at home. I've been lucky enough to feel like I belonged in the places that I've lived. And that's a privilege. Not everybody gets to feel that way. It's only in the moments where someone else will reflect back to me that they see me as other, that I become very aware of the fact that I am not white. Right. I'm not thinking of myself as any particular race. And I think many people are not, again, until someone else reflects that to you. It can be as simple as somebody, the usually innocuous, but not always question of, oh, you're not from here, are you? Right. Which is immediately a way of just letting them know that they see you in a way that's maybe different from how you see yourself, or it could be something much more hostile, as often, unfortunately, it sometimes is. I think for Bird, he doesn't think of himself as other because he knows that this is his home, this is his neighborhood, right? It's really only when other people start to reflect that back that he starts to conceive of himself as other. And I think that is how it often is for many people. That was how it was for my experience. And so you're right. At the beginning, he's not walking around thinking of himself as someone who is of Asian descent or part Asian descent. It's only when other people start to make him feel not at home that suddenly becomes really a thing he's aware of. It's a great question.
Rich asks, did you struggle when writing the attack on the Asian woman as to the race of the attacker? How did you choose the attacker?
I didn't struggle at all, really. I will say that I saw a comment in the chat about how if you look at videos, people who are attacking Asians are not white. Sometimes that is true and sometimes it's not. It is something that I actually wanted to address, seeing that it was brought up. But I think the larger point is that violence comes from a lot of different places. And there are a lot of attempts, I think, to pit different racial groups against one another by saying, see, it's this group that's attacking you. Oh, it's that group that's taking all your jobs. And one of the things that I think it is so important that we talk about is that these groups, all of the groups, Asians, Black Americans, Latinos, we should not be fighting against each other. What we're really struggling against is a system in which anybody who's not white is considered less than. The same thing when we talk about different ethnic groups being in competition with each other. The thing that we're actually fighting is not each other. This is not a zero-sum game. We are fighting a system in which this kind of oppression is allowed to exist. And so in the book, I made the attacker white because it seemed important to acknowledge that happens sometimes, despite media and other attempts to suggest that it's only other people of color who are attacking Asians. It's not true. Sometimes happens, but it's not. But in this case, one of the things I was thinking about is what's actually causing this violence. And what it is a system of white supremacy, a system of saying that only white and particularly Christian and straight people are the ones. So yeah, it wasn't a struggle for me to do that. And I feel like that was important to have out there.
Okay. Judy is saying, for someone who has never read a book by Celeste Ng, which one should be read first?
I would say if you want to read any of them, I would be grateful. Grab the one that speaks to you. I think they're very different in some ways. Everything I Never Told You is, I think it's a family story. It's a story about one particular nuclear family and some of the struggles that they're having with each other. Little Fires Everywhere, I think, is a story that's about a community in particular and about some larger social issues. And as my editor put it, Our Missing Hearts is maybe in some ways you could see it as the story of a nation. But I think that all three of them are dealing with really similar themes. I think they're all dealing with questions about what parents pass on to their children or what one generation passes on to the next or finds that it can't. They're all dealing with questions of identity and how you see yourself versus how other people see you and how you navigate that space. And I think they're all dealing with questions of art too, which is what can art do for us? What can art teach us? What can stories teach us in particular? So if any of those grab you, I hope you'll like any of them, but grab whichever one you like.
Alan asks, the setting in Cambridge evoked another dystopia set there, The Handmaid's Tale. Did you choose that setting because of The Handmaid's Tale, or is it a mere coincidence?
It's not exactly a coincidence. I said Cambridge because I live in Cambridge right now. And so it was an area that I knew. I knew in doing that, I was also sort of tipping my hat to The Handmaid's Tale, which is famously set there. But another reason I chose it is that Cambridge is often seen by people who live here and people who don't live here as a bubble. And particularly a liberal bubble. There's the idea that, oh, these things don't happen here. That's just a happy little place where there's never any discrimination and it's a utopia. And of course, that's not true anywhere. Scary things in the past few years is I've been walking through Harvard Square and I've seen people run into the street and give a Nazi salute. I wanted in some ways to acknowledge that this can happen anywhere. And so if you see it happening in the novel, you see incidents of discrimination and intolerance happening in the novel, and you have to reckon with the fact that, oh, this is in Cambridge. I didn't think that could happen there. in a way, I hope it gets you thinking that maybe this can happen anywhere, because it does.
I mean, it's like similar to all the anti-Semitism and all of these things happening literally now in the news every day. And
exactly. I think everybody wants to believe that, where they are is better than that, or that there is some place that is immune to that, right? And the scary thing, of course, is that there isn't a place that's immune to it. We have to kind of look for it everywhere and be aware of it.
Barbara comments, your writing sings. The beautiful words jump off the page with eagerness to be heard. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that.
Michelle asks, the book really reflects a lot of what we are going through today in our political life. I'm wondering why you didn't include a pandemic as part of the crisis.
This is a great question. I usually shy away from writing about things that are happening now, in part because I feel, just for myself, that I need some distance from them. And this is why my previous 2 books take place in the past. Everything I Never Told You takes place in the 50s and the 70s, and Little Fires Everywhere takes place in the 90s. I was recently horrified to hear that referred to as historical fiction.
Oh my gosh, no, I don't accept that.
But in a sense, they're right. We have some distance from that time, right? In this case, because I was writing during the pandemic, I didn't know where it was going. I still don't know where it's going. It is still ongoing now. And so in a way, I don't feel like I can see it with any clarity. So I didn't want to tie it specifically to this pandemic, because in a way, my experience is still being shaped. Other people's experiences are still being shaped. We don't know what it is yet. And kudos to the writers who have taken it on. I really admire that. But I did want to write about the feeling of being in this pandemic as I felt it, which is this sense of pervasive fear that, remember at the beginning of the pandemic, most of us were locked up in our houses. We didn't know if it was safe to see our friends and neighbors. We couldn't see them in many cases. We didn't know what was a threat. We were here, we were wiping down our mail and our groceries. And I think most people were doing the same because we just didn't know where we needed to put our attention. And so everything was threatening. And in a sense, that's, I think, how Bird's world feels for him at a certain point, of just sort of not knowing who you can trust. Mm-hmm. And so the pandemic certainly influenced it, even though it doesn't make an appearance in the book per se. It's a great question.
Lainey and Mindy ask, how did you decide on the name Bird for the character?
It's a great question. I honestly, I had a friend whose kid nicknamed themselves Bird. And I just thought that was a great nickname. And immediately I started imagining a kid who might be like that, who immediately became very different from my friend's kid. And I asked, my friend and her kid if we could use the nickname for this other character, and they graciously said yes. I started thinking about the nickname. I just thought it was a sweet name, but then it suggested a character to me, somebody who was maybe a little bit shy or a little bit reticent, seemed skittish and easy to scare away, which I think Bird is. But at the same time, birds can also take flight, right? Birds can also sort of burst into song and be quite noisy when they need to. And that felt like another side of his character. I liked the idea that name encapsulated who he was.
Amazing. Christine says, hello, I'm watching from a reading club in Denmark. We have just read one of your books and talked about it tonight. I'm wondering if it is fair to say that the parent-child story is a leitmotif in your novels. Thank you for sharing your thoughts today.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. And hi in Denmark. I think that's true. I think that there are certain themes or topics that writers tend to come back to. And for me, I'm realizing one of those things is parents and children. In part because I am in this position where, as I said, I'm a daughter, but I'm also a parent. And I'm kind of looking in both of those directions at the same time. And the more I parent, the more I start to understand why my parents parented me in certain ways. And I'm starting to see what parts of their parenting I really value and how they shape me. And I'm trying to think about how to pass them on. And so for me, that just seems like such a fundamental and rich relationship. And I keep coming back to it in my work.
Joanne asks, what part of the book was the most fun to write, and how did you celebrate when you finished your book?
Oh, I love this question. This is such a joy-filled question. We usually talk about like what's hard in the book and how hard it was, because it is. Writing a book is sometimes very agonizing. I really liked writing the character of Sadie. Sadie is Bird's friend who's about his age and similarly has been separated from her parents, just in different circumstances. Sadie was a real joy to write because in some ways she's the kind of person a lot of us might like to be. She really takes action. She really refuses to back down on her principles, and she makes things happen. So she was a joy to write, even though she has struggles in her story. I really did enjoy writing the trip through New York. It's a place that I love, as you can probably tell. And I enjoyed writing about libraries too, because I grew up going to libraries. I still love them and take my computer to work in them, or did before the pandemic. And it was really wonderful to get to kind of celebrate them on the page. As for how I celebrated, I don't remember specifically, but I'm fairly sure it involved candy. I usually kind of bribe myself through the writing day with the promise of some candy afterwards. So I think when I finished, I probably got myself some candy and had a little treat at the end of the day.
Oh, we can FedEx you our hundreds of pieces of Halloween candy if you want to get through your next novel.
I know we have too many in our house. There was my son somehow came home with a huge pumpkin full of candy, and I was like, how is this possible?
Our pumpkin even broke. It was that overloaded.
Oh, wow.
The handle just snapped. I know, it's not a good look. Anyway, Erin asks, warm greetings from the Bulloffs in Cleveland who are big fans. Just wondering, just wondering why you write dialogue without quotation marks.
Oh, this is a great question. So in my previous two books, I have used quotation marks. And in this one, I started writing, and to my own surprise, I found out that I was not using quotation marks. And I will admit that I am usually irritated when there are no quotation marks. So I will apologize to all of you who feel similarly. But as a writer, I think, one of the things you have to do is you follow your instincts, and then you kind of pause and you check, why am I doing that? Does it make sense? Does it serve the story I'm telling? And I realized that one of the things that I was thinking about is the way that stories get told, not just in books, but literally told, in spoken ways. Stories around the campfire, or bedtime stories, or just family stories that people just pass on in an oral tradition. And one of the things that happens when you're being literally told a story, like from someone's voice, is that the voice of the person telling it and the voices of all the people in the story kind of start to blur together, right? Maybe it's your mom telling you the story, but you hear your grandmother's voice through her voice, right? You hear all those things. There's a little bit of a dreamy quality to it. There's a little bit of the sense that the past and the present are kind of overlapping in each other. And there's a little bit of a fairy tale quality too, because that's often how it works in fairy tales and folk tales. And I wanted the reader to have that same feeling. I think it's the feeling that Bird has in the story. He feels a little bit like he's in a fairy tale. And I wanted the reader to have the sense that this almost could be a story that was being told to them as well at some later point in time. And so the lack of quotation marks, I think, fit in with that. It blends the real, the present and the past, and the sort of real and the stories that Bird's feeling.
Alan asks, what writers and books do you read to make you a better writer?
Oh, this is a great question. I try to read really widely. I try to challenge myself to read things that I wouldn't ordinarily pick up, because I feel like there's always something to be learned there. I do read a lot of nonfiction, as well as I try to read as much contemporary literary fiction as I can. I try to read nonfiction in particular about topics that don't seem relevant to my books, but that interest me for some reason. So a lot of science writing, for some reason, it sparks my imagination. And I find that it gets me thinking about the world in a different way. And then particularly with this book, I've been reading a lot of poetry as well. I love poetry, and I think there's something really amazing in the economy of language and in the way poets can focus your attention on just one moment or one thing or one interaction, and then kind of unfold that like it's an origami box that they're opening up to take on bigger meaning. It just in poetry is really incredible, and it's a good way to keep my language sharp and fresh.
Who knew? Ronnie and Sharon asks, when you start writing a book, do you know the ending and then develop the book toward that ending, or do you figure out the ending as you are writing? And are you an outliner or a pantser when it comes to writing your novels? And then finally, same question, by the time you're close to finishing, do you find you change things in the novel as it evolves and possibly move away from where you thought the story would go?
The answer to all those is yes. When I start off with the book, I usually have some idea of where I'm going. I always start with characters and a situation or a person that I just don't totally understand. And I'm trying to figure out how we got into this situation or where it's going to lead to. So in Little Fires Everywhere, I started with, why would somebody burn their house down, for example? And I have an idea of where I'm going, but I don't always end up there. I go in that direction. I say it's like a road trip. I have a destination in mind, but sometimes along the way, I realize that actually I don't want to go to that place. I want to go to this other place that seems much more interesting. And so there is a lot of discovery along the way. Generally speaking, I'm thinking through the past 3 books, where the ending was the right place, but I didn't take the route I expected to get there. And so the question about whether I'm an outliner or a pantser, I guess that makes me a pantser, which is a thing writing people say where they mean you're flying by the seat of your pants. I think that's where that comes from. But what I do is in the first draft, I kind of follow, I follow the seat of my pants. I follow my instincts and I just go wherever the story seems to take me. And I do a lot of discovering along the way. And it's in the revisions that I go back and I try to kind of shape the journey and give it a little bit of sense and intentionality and figure out the best way to tell the story now that I know what the story is.
Okay. Elif asks, I follow you on Insta and I'm somewhat obsessed with your miniatures. How does this hobby mesh with who you are as a writer in person?
This is a big question. I've been thinking about this. So if any of you follow me on Instagram, you'll know that I post pictures of miniatures that I make or sometimes that I get from other places. I haven't been a lot yet. I've been on book tour, but I have a lot of plans for miniatures that I plan to do once I hunker down for the fall. So the miniatures will be back. I've been a miniaturist since I was a kid. I had a dollhouse, which I stole from my sister and then just started making things for. And so it's always been something that I loved. And I used to do it as sort of a side hobby / side business for a while. I would make miniature foods. And I used to think it had nothing to do with my writing. It was actually a thing I did as a break from, grad school work or college work or now from drafting. It was like, it doesn't have to do with words. It's great. I can think about it. But maybe they are related on a deep level. I think that one thing I love about making miniatures in particular is that you have to observe really closely. You have to really look at something, what its shape is, what its texture is, how it's put together. And then you think about how to recreate that. And that's not that dissimilar from what you do as a writer. In some ways, you have to observe really closely and you have to pay attention. And in a way, paying attention is sort of what we want out of books. We want it to sort of direct our attention towards something and really make us look. And so maybe that's the sort of deep-rooted psychological overlap between those two things.
I'll go with that. We'll take that.
Also, little things are just kind of cool. It's sort of fun. So.
Little things are cool. Okay, we've done most of these. I guess let's try from Jade. Hi, Celeste. I have one question about why you designed the story of Chinese characters of a slave, a cat, and Margaret's last name, Mew. Or Meow. How do you pronounce it? How did you find the inspiration? And why did you have these in the book?
Oh, so there's a section in the novel in which Bird's father, who's a linguist, kind of breaks down the etymology of a couple of Chinese characters. And, oh, good. Thank you for the visual. So you can see in there, I don't speak Chinese, and one of the things that I've been doing as an adult is to try to learn Cantonese in particular, which is my family's language. And it is really hard. It's really hard. So I feel like this is going to be a lifelong learning process. But one thing that helps me is learning the characters. And my dad was really interested in this, before he passed away, in sort of figuring out sort of the roots of Chinese characters. And to those of us who don't know a lot about Chinese, it might just look like a bunch of squiggles or a picture. Some of them are. But there are actually parts of the character that you can look at, and you can figure out what the meaning is or hints about the etymology. The same way, if you look at, for example, Romance language, you can figure out what the Latin roots are, and then you get a sense of what the word might mean. And so I've been learning about that just for my own education. And I learned about the word for cat, which is one of the words that's in there, and that it connects to this last name and the different ways that people think that the character evolved, and different ways that those pieces of the word could suggest different connotations of those words. And I thought that was really fascinating. And because one of the folktales at the center of this story has to do with cats, it felt almost sort of like a cosmic thing, that I was thinking about these stories and I was thinking about these words, and they kind of dovetailed together in the story. So that's how it came about.
I love that your dad was interested in etymology. And then, of course, you have Bird's dad starting out the same thing with like dissecting all the words.
Yeah. And in a sense, too, I mean, that's me, and I'm sure my son, should he get older and read the book, will be like, oh, yeah, that's my mom. She's always trying to explain to me how words relate to each other.
Okay, last question from Christine. It seems you like your characters to dig out knowledge they do not know yet, or clear secrets. Is it understood correctly?
I think that's true. I think that when I'm writing the book, I'm trying to figure out things that I don't understand. And I think that when we go to books, we're hoping to have some kind of learning, right? It might not be facts, it might be emotional learning, but I think those are the stories that we tend to want to have, because stories are how we make meaning out of the world. I think for most of us, they help us understand things, whether it's ourselves, whether it's how other people work, whether it's relationships, all of that. And so I think I'm really drawn, you're right, to stories in which characters are trying very hard to understand something about themselves or their world that's been hidden to them. And the story is how they get it. It's a great question.
My last question is, when you're not thinking analytically and deeply about your characters and your stories and all of this stuff, what do you like to do to just relax and kick back and whatever?
Oh, this is a great question. Well, miniatures, I've already been outed as a miniaturist. I love to do a lot of things that are that don't involve words, honestly. So I do a lot of crafts. I knit and crochet. I cook. I garden. I play video games with my kid. I love video games, actually, even before he was around. So I'm happy that he likes them now too. And I watch TV and I read and I do all the things that people do. But I do like to make things. And so when I really want to relax, I will go and make something, whether it is a pie or whether it is like planting bulbs in my garden, which I need to do later this week before it frosts, or or knitting something. If I'm making something, I'm usually pretty happy.
Wonderful. Well, Celeste, thank you so much. And Marjorie and the Streicker Center, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you to the Streicker Center. And thank you to all of you who have tuned in. It's really a pleasure to get to talk with you.
Thank you. I'd like to add my thanks to both of you. That was just the most inspiring and interesting and wonderful interview. It was really terrific. We are going to leave the Zoom open for about 2 minutes because we are selling your book and people are buying and buying, as they should, because you've not read this.
Thank you for that.
You really must. The other thing is, if you do miss it on our link there, just call the Streicker Center. Certainly we'd be happy to supply the book. Sibi, thank you. Celeste, thank you. And everybody who's watching, next week at this time, we have Linda Cohen-Leugman and Jean Meltzer, which will be fun as well. Yeah. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you all again so much.
Thank you. So actually, my two guests can turn off their mics and the video. We're leaving it open for another moment, though.
Well, thank you again. And thank you again to everybody who's out there joining and reading.
Thank you, Celeste. Keep writing.